At the very moment when it seemed the clock was about to expire, something unexpected happened. The clock didn't just stop, it was quietly reset. And almost immediately, a second development emerged from an entirely different direction. Russia reached out to Iran, signaling that it is preparing for what comes next. Most observers are treating these as separate, just another delayed deadline here and a routine diplomatic contact there. But that interpretation completely misses what's really happening. These are not two independent stories. They are part of a single coordinated moment unfolding in stages. If you fail to connect them, you miss the underlying strategy. So let's walk through this carefully, because once you strip away the noise, the situation becomes surprisingly clear. Deadlines don't shift without purpose, and timing like this is never accidental. When you align the delay with the signal that followed, a clear pattern begins to emerge. And that pattern tells us we are not witnessing hesitation. We are seeing repositioning just before the next phase begins. Now, here is the first point you need to understand, and it's more deliberate than it appears. Donald Trump didn't just casually make remarks this morning. He reframed the entire situation. In one moment, speaking to Bloomberg, he stated that the ceasefire would now expire Wednesday evening, immediately shifting expectations. Then, almost right after, in a conversation with PBS, he raised the stakes dramatically, warning that if no deal is reached, bombs could start falling. But just as that creates a sense of urgency, he pulls back in the same breath, saying he feels no pressure and no obligation to finalize any agreement within 6 weeks. Think about what that means. Within a single time frame, he escalates the situation toward imminent conflict, then removes any sense of deadline pressure. Urgency is both created and neutralized at the same time. Many in the media interpret this as inconsistency or even confusion, but that reading is superficial. This is controlled signaling, a message designed to be interpreted differently depending on the audience. And if you want to understand why the next move unfolded the way it did, you have to read that signal correctly. Now comes the second piece, and this is where everything starts to lock into place. Sergei Lavrov held a phone call with Abbas Araghchi, and this was far from a routine diplomatic exchange. The Russian Foreign Ministry didn't just confirm the conversation. They published its language, and every word was carefully chosen. Russia reaffirmed its readiness to assist in resolving the crisis, but more importantly, it emphasized its willingness to help facilitate agreements acceptable to all parties, particularly between Iran and the Gulf states. That is not vague diplomacy. It is strategic positioning. Iran's response completes this exchange. It offered a clear commitment to ensure uninterrupted passage for Russian vessels and cargo through the Strait of Hormuz. This is real-time reciprocity. Russia secures strategic access through one of the most critical choke points in the world, while Iran gains Russian backing and diplomatic cover for whatever comes next. Two foreign ministers, one call, and both sides walk away with tangible gains. Now step back and look at the timing. Trump shifts the deadline and reshapes the pressure dynamics. And within the same 12-hour window, Russia and Iran lock in a coordinated understanding. These are not separate developments. They are two expressions of the same underlying structure playing out in real time. This is the exact pattern I've been pointing to, not as a prediction tied to a specific day, but as the natural logic of how this situation evolves. The system itself produced both moves simultaneously. If you don't understand that mechanism, then what happens on Wednesday will seem surprising. But if you do understand it, then what comes next is not only predictable, it is already in motion. Let me slow this down and explain it clearly. What I said before, what has actually happened over the past 72 hours, and why none of this is random. Because if you only focus on surface-level events, you miss the deeper logic driving everything. I said the deadline would move, and it did. Not by chance, but because every deadline Donald Trump has set in this conflict has followed the same pattern. Each one was tied to specific conditions. Keep the Strait of Hormuz open, halt nuclear enrichment, push Iran toward compliance. And every time the deadline arrived, those conditions remained unmet. So the real question becomes simple. When you draw a line and the other side refuses to cross it, what do? You either enforce that line with consequences that fundamentally change the situation, or you quietly redraw the line and buy more time. What we've seen since February 28 is not inconsistency, it is a repeated choice. Because enforcing that line doesn't mean a limited strike or symbolic escalation. It means entering a full-scale conflict with Iran, a country nearly 4 times the size of Iraq, with a population of around 90 million, difficult mountainous terrain, and decades of preparation specifically designed to absorb and resist invasion. That is not a short war. It is a long-term strategic commitment with no clear exit. Within the U.S. military chain of command, there is no clean, executable plan for that scenario. So the cost of enforcing the deadline becomes greater than the cost of extending it. And when that calculation repeats itself, the outcome becomes predictable. The deadline moves, not as a sign of weakness, but as a function of the system itself. Now we come to the second layer, and this is where most people are not paying attention. I said Russia was positioning itself for this exact moment, not to fight, not to escalate militarily, but to shape what comes after. Structurally, Russia's role in this conflict has never been about direct confrontation with the United States. It has been about making itself unavoidable in any final resolution. And today, Sergei Lavrov made that positioning explicit. He didn't speak about mediating between Iran and the United States. Instead, he focused on facilitating agreements between Iran and the Gulf Arab states. That distinction matters. It shows that Russia is stepping directly into the regional framework that will define the post-conflict balance, before any deal even exists. This is pre-positioning influence. It is not reactive diplomacy. It is strategic insertion. And the fact that this message was delivered publicly at the exact moment the ceasefire clock is running down is no coincidence. That is timing with intent. This is where everything connects. What we are witnessing is not chaos. It is a system producing outcomes based on incentives and constraints. Russia is executing a strategy I described before, and today provides a perfect example of it in action. I call it the absent profiteer. Russia doesn't need to fire a single shot to benefit from this war. It gains leverage as a mediator, strengthens its role in regional negotiations, and positions itself as a necessary bridge between opposing sides, all while avoiding direct confrontation. So when you align the shifting deadline with the Lavrov call, you are not looking at separate developments. You are seeing the same mechanism unfold from 2 different angles. And once you recognize that clearly, the bigger picture comes into focus. This is not just about what happened today. It's about who is shaping what comes next. Start with the first layer, because it explains why Russia has no reason to rush. As tensions around Iran escalated and uncertainty grew around the Strait of Hormuz, global oil markets reacted immediately. Prices surged toward the $120 per barrel range, and that single movement reshaped the economics of the entire conflict. Russia, as one of the world's largest energy exporters, didn't need to take aggressive action. It simply had to exist within that moment. And here is what most people overlook. In response to the energy shock, the United States eased pressure on Russian oil flows to stabilize global supply. In other words, a conflict that Washington was trying to contain indirectly increased Russia's revenues. The system itself created those conditions. Russia didn't need to threaten or escalate militarily. It remained aligned with Iran, allowed the crisis to tighten the oil market, and let global demand do the rest. The longer uncertainty persists, the longer elevated prices remain. And that translates into millions of additional dollars flowing into Russian coffers every day. This is what I mean by the absent profiteer. Russia benefits without stepping onto the battlefield. It doesn't need a rapid resolution. It needs an outcome that preserves this leverage for as long as possible. Now move to the second layer, where the strategy becomes even clearer. Sergei Lavrov made a series of statements in Beijing that many in Western media dismissed as background noise. In reality, they redefined the entire negotiation framework. He stated clearly that Russia would accept any nuclear decision made by Iran, while also explicitly supporting Iran's right to enrich uranium for peaceful purposes. But more importantly, he revived a very specific proposal. Russia is willing to take Iran's highly enriched uranium and reprocess it into fuel for civilian nuclear use. It may sound technical, but it represents a major geopolitical shift. The United States has consistently demanded control, the removal of enriched material under conditions that reinforce American oversight. Russia's proposal achieves the same technical outcome. The uranium leaves Iran, but completely changes who controls the process. If Iran accepts, the material goes to Moscow, not Washington. That means Russia becomes the long-term custodian of Iran's nuclear capacity. What this means, when you really step back and think about it, is far more significant than it first appears. Russia is not just offering a technical solution, it is embedding itself directly into Iran's strategic infrastructure for years, possibly even decades. And the implications of that are enormous. The central issue that has repeatedly stalled negotiations, whether in places like Islamabad or elsewhere, has always been about control and trust. The United States wants guarantees tied to its own systems of oversight, while Iran fundamentally distrusts those guarantees. Now Russia has introduced a third pathway, one that meets the technical requirements while avoiding political surrender. Under this framework, Iran retains its dignity and avoids handing over leverage to a rival. The United States can still claim progress if enriched uranium is removed. But Russia gains something far more valuable: lasting influence over one of the most sensitive strategic assets in the region. And the timing of this proposal is just as important as its substance. By making it public at a moment when negotiations are under pressure, Russia is sending a direct message to Iranian decision-makers. There is an alternative, and it does not require accepting American terms on the most critical issue. This is not passive diplomacy. It is a carefully calculated move placed precisely where it will have maximum impact. Now, this is where the counter-argument begins to lose strength. If you look closely at what actually unfolded, the details don't fit a routine explanation. The call between Sergei Lavrov and Abbas Araghchi introduced elements that go beyond the established pattern. And this leads us into the third layer, the one most directly tied to today's developments. Russia is not merely reacting to events, it is actively positioning itself as the architect of what comes after the conflict. Pay close attention to the language coming out of Moscow. It is not focused on negotiations between Iran and the United States. Instead, it emphasizes Iran's relationships with the Gulf Arab states, countries like Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Kuwait. That shift matters because those relationships will ultimately determine who shapes energy politics in the Persian Gulf for the next generation. This is not theoretical. Russia has already signaled this role before, particularly when it helped facilitate the Iran-Saudi rapprochement in 2023, a move that caught Washington off guard. What we are seeing now is the next phase of that strategy. Russia is preparing to broker a broader regional settlement, one that will determine whether Iran emerges from this conflict isolated or reestablished as a recognized regional power, backed by security understandings with its neighbors. If Russia succeeds in that role, it gains something far more valuable than short-term leverage. It secures long-term diplomatic influence in a region where it has historically not been dominant. When you compare this approach to how the United States built its position in the Middle East, the contrast becomes clear. For more than 6 decades, The US relied on military bases, defense agreements, and security guarantees, an approach that has cost trillions of dollars. Russia, by contrast, is building influence through timing, diplomacy, and carefully calculated engagement, one conversation at a time. So when Moscow signals that it stands ready, that message is not about ending the conflict in that moment. It is about ensuring that no matter what happens next, whether it is a ceasefire extension, a negotiated deal, or renewed conflict, Russia is already embedded in the process. A call that took place just before the deadline pressure peaks is not routine. It is a signal of presence. It is Russia making one thing clear. Whatever negotiating table emerges after Wednesday, it will be sitting at it. Now here is the critical connection. The shifting deadline and Russia's outreach are not separate developments. They are both expressions of the same structural reality. The United States cannot resolve this conflict alone. Not because the pressure is insignificant. It is very real. Disruptions to shipping, economic strain, currency fluctuations, these are all measurable pressures. But there is a difference between pressure and decisive pressure, and that gap is being filled by external support. Russia benefits economically from prolonged instability through higher oil prices. China continues to purchase Iranian energy and provides diplomatic backing in international institutions. Together, they create a buffer that prevents Iran from reaching a breaking point where it must accept American terms without conditions. So when the deadline approaches, it cannot hold rigidly, because enforcing it would require escalation into a phase of conflict that is far more costly, uncertain, and prolonged than anything seen so far. This is why decision-making on both sides begins to converge. Donald Trump and his advisors understand the risks of escalation. Russia understands the leverage created by that hesitation. So the deadline moves, not as a retreat, but as a recalibration. And at that exact moment, Russia steps forward to reinforce its position, knowing that all sides are approaching a point where external facilitation becomes necessary. Iran needs a way to resolve the nuclear issue without losing face. Gulf states need a framework that does not leave them exposed. The United States needs to avoid a broader war while maintaining strategic credibility. Russia positions itself as the solution to all three pressures at once and uses that positioning as leverage. To be fair, there is a counter-argument, and it deserves consideration. One could say that the deadline only shifted slightly, not enough to signal a major strategic change. It could also be argued that Russia's call was routine, part of an ongoing pattern of communication since the conflict began. Analysts have noted multiple conversations between Sergei Lavrov and Iranian officials over recent months, and phrases like "stands ready" have appeared before. From that perspective, today's developments could be seen as continuity rather than transformation. At the same time, mixed signals from Iran, conflicting reports about negotiations and participation in talks, suggest that diplomacy is still active rather than collapsing. If back-channel discussions are progressing more than what is publicly visible, then a deal before the next deadline remains possible. That interpretation frames the situation as ongoing negotiation, not escalation. But here is the key distinction. Even if each individual development appears routine in isolation, it is their timing and alignment that changes their meaning. The deadline shift, the diplomatic messaging, and Russia's positioning. Taken separately, they can be explained away. Taken together, they reveal a pattern. And that pattern points to something much larger than a single day's events. It shows how the next phase of this conflict is already being shaped before it officially begins. You can see this in clear, measurable ways. First, Iran did not simply restate a position. It confirmed a specific operational guarantee, a readiness to ensure uninterrupted passage of Russian vessels and cargo through the Strait of Hormuz. That is not filler language. It is a concrete commitment with immediate strategic and commercial value. In return, Russia reaffirmed its readiness to facilitate outcomes moving forward. This is not just alignment, it is reciprocity. Earlier exchanges were about signaling intent. This one establishes an arrangement. Russia secures reliable access through the world's most critical energy corridor, while Iran secures Russian backing at the exact moment the next phase of the conflict is about to unfold. The second shift is even more significant. Lavrov's uranium proposal, stating that Russia will accept any decision Iran makes regarding enriched uranium, is now fully public, positioned directly alongside the United States stance, which has consistently required Iran to hand over that material under American-aligned conditions. This changes the negotiation dynamic completely. For the first time, there is a visible third option on the table. If Iran enters negotiations, knowing that Russia is willing to take custody of the uranium on its own terms, then the pressure structure inside those talks changes fundamentally. It is no longer a simple choice between compliance and defiance. It becomes a strategic decision between competing external partners. And that option is calibrated with precision. It offers Iran something Washington's proposal does not: a pathway that avoids public capitulation. It is Russia inserting itself directly into the final stage of negotiations as an alternative route on the most sensitive, unresolved issue. Then there is the silence from the United States. There has been no strong public pushback, no direct framing of Russia's proposal as interference, no effort to reshape the narrative. And in a situation like this, silence is not neutral. It carries meaning. It suggests one of two possibilities. Either the United States believes the proposal will not gain traction, or it has already adjusted to a scenario where Russia plays a role in the final arrangement and is prepared to present that outcome as a diplomatic success. Either way, it changes what the deadline actually represents. It is no longer just about whether a deal is reached. It is about who defines the terms of that deal. At the same time, on the Iranian side, you can observe something equally important. Public statements continue to project defiance, with clear messaging that they will not. The situation reflects a coordinated geopolitical shift where the US, Russia, and Iran are simultaneously adjusting their strategies, signaling that no single power can control the outcome alone. As deadlines shift and diplomacy intensifies, the real battle is not just about reaching a deal, but about who shapes the terms and influence of the next phase.